On the 14th of June 1381, the Archbishop of Canterbury was dragged out of the Tower of London kicking and screaming, and he was taken up to Tower Hill, the public site of beheading in London. Simon Sudbury was, during the Peasants Revolt, a figure of extreme hatred for the rebels, who were rising up to defy the many taxes which were imposed upon them. Sudbury was executed in brutal fashion, and he was also the Lord Chancellor, and was a target when the rebels burst into the Tower of London. But what happened with his brutal execution that day, in front of a huge crowd and a fearsome, angry mob? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Simon Sudbury was born in 1316, and he rose to the position of being a chaplain and a priest to Pope Innocent VI, and he studied at the University of Paris. He was then sent on a mission to work alongside the English King Edward III. He then became an important part of the King's government, and was made the Chancellor of Salisbury in 1361, and was then appointed the Bishop of London. He was consecrated on this position on the 20th of March 1362, but he then 13 years later succeeded to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. After the death of King Edward III, Simon Sudbury crowned the new King Richard II inside of Westminster Abbey, but in January 1380 he then became the Lord Chancellor of England. At the time, the peasants across England, especially in the south, were becoming increasingly angry and desperate. Many taxes, including a controversial third poll tax, were levied against them for foreign wars, and this made Richard II incredibly unpopular and led to the uprising known as the Peasants Revolt. The Peasants Revolt broke out on the south coast of England, and the rebels made their way to London to request a meeting with the king, and on the 14th of June 1381, the rebels continued along the River Thames, having entered London the previous day. They burned down houses around Westminster and opened prisons, and they then stormed the Tower of London, a prominent symbol of the king's power. It's not known if the guards, terrified at the sight of hundreds of rebels, just let them in, but when inside the tower, the rebels inflicted a huge amount of terror. They began to search for their key targets, and sitting inside the spectacular chapel found inside the central White Tower, the oldest part of the Tower of London, was Simon Sudbury, who was praying. He was then taken out of the tower, along with a number of other prominent members of the government and royal entourage, and Sudbury, who, let's remember, was the Archbishop of Canterbury, was the most senior church official inside of England. He was dragged out like a common criminal, and was marched on the short walk north to Tower Hill. Here there was one rebel armed with a sword, ready to take the head off the shoulders of Simon Sudbury. Alongside the Lord High Treasurer Robert Hales, Sudbury was placed on a small scaffold in front of the crowd, whilst an executioner armed with his sword crashed down 8 frenzied and bloody blows with his weapon upon the Archbishop's neck. This was not a skilled execution, but a botched slaughtering in the name of the Peasants' Revolt. The executioner also took off the fingers of Sudbury from one of his hands. His body was then left on the scaffold all day, and his head, which had his clerical hood nailed to it, was placed on a pole, and this was then placed high above London Bridge. His head was then taken down 6 days later, and his body was collected and was then taken to Canterbury Cathedral for burial. Interestingly, the body of Sudbury still lies inside of Canterbury Cathedral today, in a tomb. However, it does not contain his head, but instead there is a cannonball placed where his head once was. The head of Sudbury was taken down by William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, and it was kept at St Gregory's Church in Sudbury, and it is still here today, preserved inside of a box. The execution of Simon Sudbury was barbaric and brutal, and he was hacked to pieces for his links to the government of King Richard II. He was probably one of the most famous churchmen at the time across the world, and was one of the most famous people in England without doubt following the king. The Peasants' Revolt was a ruthless attack upon London, and eventually fizzled out as the king promised to give in, and he then later went back on his claims. But Simon Sudbury's ruthless execution today is rather forgotten. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.